It's a pleasure and a privilege to have been invited here this evening to give this lecture on what is clearly such an important occasion as a commemoration of Winifred, or Winnie, as I think I'm now entitled to call her. I propose to open my remarks this evening with what I hope will be a crowd-pleasing assertion, at least in this audience. And it is that education is a human and civil right and a public good. This assertion is central to the philosophy and politics of the Global Union Federation for Education Unions, Education International, an organisation bringing together 30 million teachers through their unions worldwide. It is, of course, also central to the philosophy and policies and politics of the National Union of Teachers. And finally, it's even enshrined in the constitution of a country to which I shall refer several times this evening, namely Finland. You probably could have guessed that it was Finland as I opened my remarks, couldn't you? We are, however, in many countries, living through a period and under governments whose prevailing philosophy is at variance with this principle. Pasi Sahlberg, a Finnish educationalist with whom many of you will be familiar, was the first to coin the expression global education reform movement. Global education reform movement. The words are well chosen, giving us, as they do, the acronym GERM. It is this germ that has infected many education systems, but perhaps more especially those in Anglo Saxon jurisdictions and in some developing country jurisdictions where aid and development funding have been tied very closely to the neoliberal agenda. I'll come to the characteristics of germ in a moment, but let's just explore why it is that the World Bank, the IMF, and large multinational corporations have become, over the last 2 to 3 decades, so interested in education. It is, of course, because education is expensive, or at least it should be. And this means that large sums of money are available to be spent on education. For the most part, this is taxpayers' money being spent through public authorities on the provision of a public good. It's what we might call public investment. However, where we see investment, others see with different approaches and attitudes in politics, see something different. They see the potential for profit. It is for this reason that structural adjustment programs, as required by the IMF and the World Bank, require cuts to public spending and the creation of markets and the privatisation of public services. From these policies, as wished on countries by those often known as the masters of the universe, have come many of the unacceptable aspects of education reform. It is indeed the classic case of those who know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Teachers, and in particular teachers' unions, are often seen as the great block to reform. This becomes characterised as teachers and their unions standing in the way of progress and modernisation, and thereby, of course, standing in the way of children and young people. Those of you with not very long memories will remember Michael Gove calling us the enemies of promise. And you will no doubt recall that he also characterised those of us in education, both in schools, but in schools of education, and of course in academia generally, and frankly anyone who disagreed with him, as the blob. We were quite often quite pleased to be associated with all of the rest of the people in the blob, I'm bound to say. At a recent meeting of the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, the Organisation for Economic and Cooperation and Development, a paper was presented on the value of an annual summit for the global education industry. Now, for the last 4 years, and it will happen again in a short while, there has been an annual summit of the teaching profession. It's a tripartite event hosted by a government, inviting other governments, inviting also representatives of teacher unions from those jurisdictions and representatives of the OECD. The parties, therefore, are governments, unions, as represented by the country-level affiliates of EI itself, and the OECD. And I've attended 2 of the 4 of them, and the NUT will be represented again in Banff in Canada this year, although not by myself, but we will be there. And I must say, they have been very interesting. It's designed to be a partnership so that governments, the OECD and teacher unions are, as it were, at the table on an equal basis. However, I must say I'm much less certain about the value of a summit for the global education industry, or what some of us call edu-business. Here are some excerpts from the OECD proposal document for this event. Doesn't start off too badly. In a broader perspective and beyond the immediate concerns about technology in schools, education ministers wish to better understand the rise of an international education industry and start the dialogue with its key representatives. I'm not even keen on that bit, but maybe not too bad. As many other sectors of public policy before, but it says also there because this is not written by a native speaker of English, education is now witnessing a growth in domestic and international businesses, developing and selling education resources, textbooks, software, courseware. Well, of course, we know that people have always produced and sold textbooks and so on. Also, educational services for schools, learning devices, learning platforms, dedicated IT solutions. Additional educational offerings to parents and learners themselves, in some cases, complete forms of distributed institutional delivery with the potential to become a commercial subsector of the system. Now, you have to read that several times before you realise that what we're talking about here is no longer having teachers, just having something which is in a classroom which somehow other people are supposed to access without actually any human intervention. In some cases, countries now recognise this. Sorry, in some countries, this is now an accepted reality. And this is the bit that I'm particularly keen on and interested in. In some, it is heavily and often ideologically opposed as a privatised intrusion into an essentially public system. Well, I put my hand up to saying that's exactly how I see it. But in most education systems, ministers have difficulty in grasping what's going on. I would say that's absolutely true. And in seeing the innovative potential of an educational industry in establishing a genuine dialogue. Now, hidden within that, I think there are some really quite frightening things for the way some people see the future of education. No one would say children shouldn't have computers. No one would say there isn't some self-directed learning that young people can do. But I think that most of us who spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about education would say that there is a lot in that excerpt which is taking us in a very dangerous and unacceptable direction. And I have to say, this sounds to me and many colleagues from teachers' unions around the world dangerously like a concerted effort at a corporate takeover of what we have hitherto believed was genuinely a public good. Now, as I said earlier, profit has, of course, always been taken from the sale of educational materials. We know that. This new, but to some of us more sinister development, is the level of control exerted by multinationals over the shape, content, and assessment of the curriculum and the amount of data they hold and who owns it. In the context of those remarks I was making earlier, here's something that Nikki Morgan said recently at the Beckett show in London, which is a technology show. She said, as we inject further choice and competition to the school system, parents and students will rightly demand more information from us so that they can exercise that choice effectively. Already, we've begun to produce destination data on school leavers to identify where they end up. We aim to include this in league tables by 2017. In future, we could try, fortunately she's only saying try, we could try to link qualifications to tax data in order to demonstrate the true worth of certain subjects. Now, I don't know what the lifetime earnings of many published authors is. Clearly, some of them make a very great deal of money. But I'm sure that there are published authors of children's books who don't make a very great deal of money and who actually have to have a second job in order to live. Equally, there are very many musicians and artists of all kinds and actors who are not getting Oscars and becoming very famous, but who contribute immensely to the cultural life that we all have. So I think the idea that we can link data to link this to tax payments in order to see the value of certain subjects demonstrates that there are people in government currently who have a very different attitude to education from that we have in the National Union of Teachers, and I hope a lot of the rest of you in this room. So I think there are questions that need to be asked about the collection and the use of data. When some years ago, when the government first said that they were, and this was actually even the Labour government, they were going to have a regular stream of robust data that would help us in our classrooms in order to improve performance. I think most of us were not saying what we lack in our classrooms is a regular stream of robust data. Anyway, I will, of course, return to what teachers and their unions could and should do about all of this, but let me turn just briefly to the elements that characterise GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement. These are characteristics which are in evidence in all of the systems infected by this particular germ. A key characteristic is standardisation. Now, I take these directly from what Pasi Sahlberg has said about it himself. No one, I imagine, would argue with an assertion that children and young people in schools should be exposed to and enjoy a broad and balanced curriculum, and that decisions about curriculum at school level should never be taken to exclude whole areas of content or experience. And in this respect, the NUT is in favour of a compulsory framework which protects entitlement to breadth and balance. And any of you who've read what Graham Donaldson has just produced in Wales, although I haven't read it in detail, it's very interesting that they have come up with the idea of a framework curriculum, and it will be for teachers to develop. Now, that has its own issues, given that we've all spent 20 years being told, now you do this, and now you do this, and now you do this. But actually, philosophically, it's where we want to be. But we probably all know that since the 1980s, there have been excessive prescription in the curriculum, particularly, probably more particularly in England, although over a period of time in Wales too. And this has been subject to change, and sometimes very significant change, and entirely at ministerial whim. Whole forests have probably been felled in producing mountains of folders and documents which have over the years dominated the lives of teachers. Some of us were teaching when the first lot came out, you know. A sub-element of this standardisation, and this is very evident in England, of course, is the focus on so-called core subjects, these being determined as literacy, which, of course, some of us didn't really think was a subject. We thought it was English, which is, of course, way beyond literacy. Numeracy, which I'm sure you would agree is not the same as mathematics, and science, which is science. Perceived success or failure in student assessment surveys such as PISA, which of course is not the Leaning Tower, but the Pupil International Student Assessment, and TIMSS and PEARLS, which are the other ones that go along with it, both in mathematics and English, has had an effect on the whole education system and has skewed the curriculum away from art, from music, from social studies, from PE. In other words, creating a diminished and impoverished curriculum for our children. And despite the best efforts of many teachers, this is, I'm afraid, clearly evident in many of our classrooms today. Although I'm bound to say, just as an aside, it wasn't evident at Bankside when I went there today, where I have to say that the school council were just remarkable. Children throughout the whole range of the primary school talking and thinking about, I'm bound to say, our Manifesto for Education and what they thought they would put into a manifesto. And I am delighted to say that the first thing that they said was, we strongly believe that politicians should listen to parents, teachers and pupils. I heartily endorse that. There's a whole list of things here, and they're all brilliant. And I pay massive tribute to the parents, to the teachers at Bankside, and to the parents who clearly support the kind of education that we would really want to see for all of our primary school kids. But along with this narrowing of the curriculum goes the separate but connected element of test-based accountability. And this can clearly be seen in the rapacious data machine brought into being by Ofsted in England and, of course, the floor targets culture. Now, data, by the way, according to John Macbeth, who is an acknowledged expert on school evaluation, is, of course, critical. But he goes on to say, not the impoverished version of the number crunchers, but the dictionary definition, and apparently this is the dictionary definition, assumption or premise from which inferences may be drawn, a starting point for exploration. Now, I really wonder how many Ofsted inspectors have ever been told that data is a starting point for exploration. He goes on to say that school evaluation must embrace the whole gamut of achievement, written, oral, experiential, individual, social and collaborative, more ambitious and encompassing than test and exam results. Now, I believe that that is what most teachers believe and what they would genuinely like to see happening. But school inspection in England, and to a very large extent, I'm afraid, in Wales, although not, of course, in Scotland and not in the north of Ireland, is not a system of support and challenge to teachers as professionals, and nor does it seek to present a picture of schools in the round. It is precisely a numbers game, where the high-stakes outcome for a school can be determined by even before an inspector steps across the threshold, as test scores are essentially all. In this context, it's little wonder that another element of the germ is the search for low-risk ways of attaining test scores which masquerade as learning outcomes. The circle for companies producing curriculum and assessment materials is thereby complete. I quote here from Stephanie Simon on the Politico website. So if you've got a bit of browsing time, I suggest you have a look at it. Pearson, she says. Now, Pearson is a British company. Many of you will know them as producers of textbooks, and actually they even now currently run some passably good CPD, apparently, in this country. But in America, they have a very different kind of operation. So Pearson, she says, wields enormous influence over American education. It writes textbooks and tests that drive instruction in public schools across the nation. Its software grades student essays. Now, it's a very long time since I graded an essay, but I'm not at all sure how I would have done it with a piece of software. But, you know, maybe I'm a Luddite. Pearson's also tracks student behaviour. It diagnoses and then treats attention deficit disorder. And the company administers teacher licensing exams and coaches teachers once they're in the classroom, and it advises principals. So you might ask, well, what doesn't it do? But this, I think, is really interesting. This is a reflection from Jonathan Zimmerman, who is an education historian at New York University, and he is quoted in that same piece as saying, the policies that Pearson is benefiting from may be wrong-headed in a million ways, but it strikes me as deeply unfair to blame Pearson. I mean, you know, it's the capitalist system. Companies are going to make money. But what he goes on to say is, when the federal government starts doing things like requiring all states to test all kids, there's going to be gold in them there hills. The people we've elected have created a landscape that has allowed Pearson's to prosper. So, you know, there is a big problem with Pearson's, and I think he's letting Pearson's off pretty lightly. But he isn't wrong that the policies born of the neoliberal agenda are actually the basic problem. And if you create the landscape, people will profit from it. Now, one of my own daughters, and admittedly this was some years ago, was subject in Year 6 to a science curriculum which saw her class ploughing through SATs practice questions week in, week out. They did other interesting stuff, but in science, they just week in, week out did SATs questions. In fact, the book they were given at the beginning of the year was called Revision for the SATs Tests. So they didn't actually learn anything, they just did the revision, which were the practice questions. Now, I'm not necessarily sure that in every school it's changed all that much in some ways since then. And it's frankly hard to blame teachers when the high-stakes nature of these tests is so significant for them personally, both in career and now, of course, in salary terms, and, of course, for their schools, because, as we all know, the agenda of forced academisation and so on, there's a lot going on there. But this approach significantly constrains the professional judgment of teachers. It makes them risk-averse in looking for new and innovative ways of teaching. It creates a compliant rather than a creative teaching force. And, according to many surveys, some of the unhappiest children in a number of international surveys. Little wonder that we are now in England seeing high rates of attrition from teaching, and according to John Howson, whose particular area is teacher recruitment, woefully inadequate levels of application to train. Now, I hope lots of people are coming here. I hope you're training lots and lots and lots of brilliant teachers. But I'm bound to say that at a national level, we are undershooting the number of teachers we need very significantly. And then finally, a significant driver of germ is the borrowing of corporate management models, the managerialist approach. Often, though, models which, by the time they're adopted in education, have become outmoded in business and actually rejected. And performance-related pay is a very good example of this. As the rigid top-down performance management to which teachers are now subjected in England and Wales demonstrates, it is taking people's eye off the ball. It is absolutely the wrong policy for us to have in education. So, as we consider these aspects of education reform, it's worth looking at what the OECD has said recently about education reform in general. Under the headline, "Trillions of dollars are spent on education reforms without any effective valuation to see if changes have worked." Now, that's quite a long headline and pretty much sums up the story. Andreas Schleicher, of whom many of you will have heard, he was, from time to time, Michael Gove's favourite educationalist. But he is quoted as saying this: "Implementation of education reform can take 10 to 15 years, much longer than is demanded by the political cycle. It can mean that many ministers are under pressure to announce new policies without any clear assessment of the half-completed previous policies." Now, I ask you, can anyone in this room remember the last time an education reform, under any government, frankly, in this country, was brought in with an implementation scale of 10 years, or any reform that was actually subject to a rigorous form of evaluation coming from the government? Some of us have done our own little evaluations, but actually the implementation with a timeline and then evaluation, because certainly I can't. Schleicher goes on to say that education spending across the OECD represents $2.5 trillion annually. I can't even imagine what $2.5 trillion is, although, of course, since the crash, we're all supposed to think about these enormous amounts of money. But $2.5 trillion. Pressure to raise standards has prompted 450 programmes of reform in the last 8 years. But only 1 in 10 of these has ever been tested for their effectiveness. So the pattern appears to be, think of an idea, quite possibly based on ideology rather than evidence, push ahead to implement it at whatever cost, both financial and in terms of the health of both the teaching profession and children, but fail to review or evaluate it. Perhaps doggedly pursue it for a while, or simply come up with a different idea to replace the one you first thought of. Now, I'm sure that many of us would actually recognise much of this in both the current government's approach to education policy and education policy under which we have suffered and laboured in the past. And we might see some of these characteristics in Ofsted. It hasn't been replaced, but neither has its effectiveness been properly, or lack of it, you might say, been properly evaluated. Always assuming, of course, that you believe that the purpose of an inspection system should have at least something to do with school improvement. Robert Coe from Durham University is very clear that there is no evidence whatever that Ofsted has done this. No evidence that Ofsted has actually contributed to school improvement, even given the enormous sums of money that's spent on it. Now, according to NUT research, this is £157 million a year. That's quite a lot of money. So over the whole period of the existence of Ofsted, that's a huge amount of money, which frankly could have been much better spent. And then, of course, there's the question of the persistent changes of framework which govern Ofsted inspections of schools, and they've left many institutions working hard to just keep up with the rules of the game. And as I'm sure you'll recall, so much disinformation exists about what is and is not actually required by Ofsted that eventually the government, under pressure from the teachers' unions, produced a myth-buster document. It was prepared and disseminated and sent out to schools, and it said, you know, Ofsted does require this, Ofsted doesn't require this. But it seems that such is the fear of Ofsted that when this myth-buster document appeared in many schools, it was believed by head teachers all over the country to be a hoax, almost certainly perpetrated by the National Union of Teachers. But I can assure you, colleagues, it's not a hoax. There is actually a myth-buster document. If you haven't seen it, you should have a look at it. Abolition of Ofsted and its replacement by a system of school self-evaluation with light-touch external oversight is really the only secure way of achieving what those of us in the education community is both desirable and achievable. That is, schools which are able to reflect seriously on policy and practice and develop sound approaches to continuous improvement. Now, when I say continuous improvement, I don't mean ever-increasing test scores. I don't mean that. I mean that everyone can always look at their practice and improve it. Sometimes you improve it, actually, by remembering what you used to do and doing it again. You know, I'm sure all of us have suddenly had a light bulb moment. We go, yeah, I used to do that. I could do that. That would be a really good idea. But as we all know, or at least we suspect, Ofsted appears to be more about changing school status in line with government policy than improving schools. And I have no doubt that both Ofsted and government would robustly defend Ofsted's independence from government. Many of us have a great deal of experience from which we can draw our own conclusions. Let me here say that in all systems, social class and affluence or poverty will always play a role in academic achievement. This is, of course, recognised in the PISA studies, the report of which in 2009 records that in reading, that if you strip out social class, maintained schools in England achieve close to or as well as the independent sector. So in other words, if you were only dealing with what kids present with, without all of the baggage, those who have less advantage would do as well. And the report also concluded that school choice is not in any sense a driver of the success of the school system at an institutional, at a whole system level. By the way, Finland, currently the most successful jurisdiction in Europe from an education point of view, has no national inspection system for schools. Many of you may well know that Pasi Sahlberg was actually the last head of inspection in Finland. 2 weeks into his term of office, his post was abolished, but he's by no means a bitter man. He actually genuinely believes that they did the right thing. So having escaped the infection by germ, Finland's approach to education and to training teachers is that teachers are trusted to do the job. In speaking of his own country's education system, Pasi Sahlberg says that it isn't accountability that they seek from teachers in schools, but responsibility. They believe that having, it's hard to get to be a primary teacher in Finland because it's so competitive, because it's such a well-respected job and people want to do it. But when they've trained those teachers to master's level and they're in schools, they're in well-funded schools, they want them to not be accountable, but responsible. And it seems to me that that is an approach that we could well think about. It's also important to note, of course, though, that Finland is essentially a more equal society than our own. So when the NUT says that questions of child poverty play a part in school achievement, we are usually accused of advancing excuses or deploying what has been called the soft bigotry of low expectations. Now, I reject that argument, and I assert that child and family poverty are not, they are absolutely categorically never used by the NUT as an excuse. But we do believe that social, financial, health and housing circumstances of families are a contributory aspect of how children and young people are able to access education and go on to achieve their potential. And of course, you can look at schools that are achieving against the odds, but they're very often not doing the things that government will want them to do. They're actually doing other things. In the foreseeable future, under any incoming government, there will be no move away from national inspection in England as it's currently composed. And actually, we may not want to move away from national inspection just because Finland doesn't have it. We may still think it's an important thing. But what is required is a rebalancing of this. We need to move away from high stakes external accountability and low trust to a better balance between the two, and to look for a holistic approach to school evaluation and what schools do. But the prevailing policies and the influence of germ and the neoliberal agenda will not get us there. But leaving Finland for a moment, let's consider other systems that are now praised by UK politicians. Those who favour the marketisation of school systems and the much vaunted choice and diversity once prayed in aid the Swedish model. Free schools in Sweden, some of which are categorically for profit, have, over the period of their existence, frankly not proved to be a success. Lärarförbundet, which is the largest teachers' union in Sweden, was not opposed to their creation right at the outset, but has frankly seen the error of their ways because they've seen the failure of the policy. With even the Swedish government recognising that schools had become segregated by social class and ethnicity. And I don't think any of us would think that that's what we want for our schools. And of course, more recently, where schools have been operating for profit in Sweden, they've gone bankrupt. Now, no one actually wants their child in a school that's gone bankrupt. So in the last year, the incoming Swedish government has moved that policy. They're not changing them entirely, but they have moved away from for-profit schools. A newer favourite of Nikki Morgan now is Poland on the question of the curriculum. She has cited Poland to boost the notion that the focus on core academic subjects is what we need to emulate from the Polish system. And yet, of course, what actually happens in Poland is that schools have the freedom to create their own curricula within a predetermined framework. The curriculum in Poland is designed to balance, and this is what they say in Poland, three goals of education: improving knowledge, developing skills, and shaping attitudes. Skills, then, often derided by current government ministers, are seen as on a par with knowledge. It's actually, that is their approach to the curriculum. Now, there are challenges for education systems, particularly in jurisdictions still badly affected by the post-2008 crash and the austerity agenda. But government ministers will not help us to rise to any of the challenges that we face in education by feeding us a distorted view of what goes on elsewhere and cherry-picking things and saying that's what we should do here. Across the world, a key reason for being a union member, if you're a teacher, is for very many a matter of individual insurance. I'm sorry to say that, but I believe it's true. Of the hundreds, literally hundreds of thousands of NUT members, most of them see their union card as being something that bears a number that if they call it when they get into difficulty, it will sort them out. Someone will come in and sort them out. However, increasingly the NUT, and I would say historically we've always done this, but increasingly we're moving towards what now has the title of social movement trade unionism. Now, I believe that we've always said we wanted to work with parents and governors. I believe we've always said that it was important that young people had a voice in their own education. I believe we've always said it was important to have community engagement. But the fact is that now there is this expression, social movement trade unionism. And this is what Sam Giddin, Canadian activist and academic, said about it in 1995. He said, social movement trade unionism means making the union into a vehicle through which its members can not only address their bargaining demands, but actively lead the fight for everything that affects working people in their communities and the country. And I have to say, I think that's where the NUT wants to be in terms of our approach to education policy. So it has some key characteristics, everything always does. So some of them are things like a concern that issues that affect the life in the workplace are addressed, but they're not limited to sectional interest. That there is a concern with equality, democracy and justice for the whole wider society. That it seeks to address underlying causes and not just symptoms, that it seeks allies and coalition partners, not the coalition partners of the government, of course, but anyway, partners in coalitions, community organisations and so on, which share the concerns that we have. That notions of solidarity, both domestic and international, are important in social movement trade unionism, and that it isn't instrumental, it's based on a vision of what we think education should be, and it isn't just pragmatic, although, frankly, a healthy dose of pragmatism is often quite important too. And it's based on maximising participation and democracy within unions at various levels, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Now, I see that as what we think we want to be doing in the National Union of Teachers. It's got a long history from the 70s and 80s, and it, you know, like most things, in some respects it started in America, but has been taken up in other places. And in Anglo Saxon countries, particularly in the global north, mostly who've been very badly affected by the neoliberal onslaught, there has definitely been a move towards this social movement trade unionism, although I think in the NUT we are absolutely at the forefront of wanting to work in that kind of way. So it is part of our organising model of wanting to make sure that we have people empowered at all levels. We've been working with colleagues in the US and indeed in Australia looking at these kinds of ideas. And it is an explicit rejection that unions only exist to service their members, because actually we are a critical part of society, and we need to be making sure that we are there empowering our members. And it isn't just about financial benefits or affinity partners. So social movement trade unionism is certainly how NUT sees its move forward, and we don't want to be limiting. And that's why we have engaged in the Stand Up for Education campaign. It's a conscious effort by the NUT to build a movement of allies, parents, community groups, sister unions, academics, children's writers, frankly, anyone with whom we can have the conversation, who can sign up to the basic ideas that are in our document. We do have, of course, wider social issues. It's perfectly clear that child poverty features in here because that is important to us. We know that the issue of the bedroom tax, I mean, I have no idea how many families you've got affected by the bedroom tax in Leeds. I know that in London, where I live, I've been into lots of schools where we've had children displaced through the bedroom tax. So these are central to our ideas of where we need to be working, and all of the issues of germ and those other types of policies are the ones that create workload pressure in schools. So we've got a complete community of interest, a coincidence with interest of our wider community. So let me say then, whilst social movement trade unionism may be in its infancy in the UK, I think we are leading the way, and we are able thereby to say that much of what individual NUT members face in their schools and classrooms day in, day out is a direct result of the global education reform movement. Last May, we had a conference in Hamilton House. At this time last year, 6 people were signed up for it. By the time we actually got to it, we were well over 100. And it was a brilliant conference. We had lots of delegates from lots of places around the world, and all of whom were talking about how the global education reform movement was impacting on their own education systems. And you could see amongst the groups of NUT members who were there, very many young teachers who'd never done anything else with the union ever before. You could see them kind of waking up to the fact that that was why they were being made to do particular things in their classroom. Not because their head teacher was a horrible person, not because their local authority was nasty, not only because the government is a problem, but actually because there is a global education reform movement reaching right down into teachers' classrooms every day and changing their practice. So we know it's happening in the US, we know it's happening in Australia, we know it's happening in plenty of places. Now, the way to getting the community involved in education questions was something that the Chicago Teachers Union did and won support for an industrial action campaign. Now, of course, if they'd just gone on strike saying we want more pay, then it's hard to imagine why it is that lots of people would have been sympathetic. But I know from Patrick that in Cause's school, when the NUT has had cause to go on strike, that working with the community, explaining to the community why it is we're doing the things, means that we do win sympathy from the community. Because although much industrial action is about pay, actually, it's also about all of these other things. Now, the Chicago Teachers Union were successful up to a point. They're still having to take more action again because they didn't win everything. But they did eventually decide to put up a candidate against Rahm Emanuel. And I don't know whether the runoff's now happened, but they did take him to a runoff. And yes, he is a Democrat, but he is one who's bought into germs. So the Chicago Teachers Union has brought quite a lot of people along with them. So that's why in the NUT we decided in the Stand Up for Education campaign to have these 3 elements which we think work together of engage, pressure, strike. So the engage is the outreach part of the campaign. I've talked to lots of people about this today. We've seen hundreds of members out on the streets finding all sorts of ways to distribute the manifesto. Many of you here tonight will have been involved in that. But it's not just about leafleting, it's about getting support from the academic and wider community and from all of those who see the good sense in the positions that we're arguing. Engage has meant NUT parties, primary colleagues getting parents to come in and have tea and talk about these ideas. It's meant education question times. It's meant, certainly in one case in early December, a sing up for education, which saw me on the streets of Fulham dressed as an elf, which I have to say is a sight to behold, and a primary school choir and a ukulele band, so that actually, who can resist a primary school choir? Everyone will stop and listen to primary school children singing. But multiple entry points, which of course is another key element of social movement trade unionism. You have to have a lot of different things that people will do. And yesterday we launched, now have I got a paper copy of it? Yes, I have. Yesterday we launched a petition, which, I mean, we've been this petition route before, but we've launched this with whatever it is, 2 months to go to the general election. We launched it with Michael Rosen, always very good value, and I'm sure, and actually I was utterly delighted. Last night my granddaughter stayed at my house, and when I went down to get her a glass of milk, I came back upstairs and she was reading to her teddy bear, I say reading, she's 3, reading we're going on a bear hunt to her teddy bear. And she read the whole thing, we're going on a bear hunt, we're not scared, what a beautiful day, the whole thing, turning the pages at exactly the right point. In 2 years' time, she'll be subject to the phonics check. She may very well fail, because actually, it won't matter to her, and other colleagues have had this experience. Kids who are already proficient readers make sense of nonsense syllables, because they think, well, why would anyone be testing nonsense? Although, of course, we do a lot of testing nonsense. And of course, the problem is if you want kids to pass the phonics check, you have to teach the nonsense, don't you? You have to teach the syllables. So, you know, I'd be delighted if my daughter decides that her daughter doesn't have to do the phonics check, because I have no fear that with the brilliant teaching that she'll get in West London and Michael Rosen's lovely books, she'll be well on the way to being a reader. Anyway, I digress completely. I have to tell you that was not in my remarks. Anyway, so we've already had 1,800 people sign up since yesterday to this petition. Well, we had by 11 o'clock this morning, which is the last time I checked. So you can sign up online, or you can sign up on a piece of paper like this and send it back to us. We do want very large numbers of people to sign up to this. And, you know, here's a quotation that I really like. Aneurin Bevan said, "Anger comes from seeing how things are and knowing how they could be." Now, we're very anxious with our manifesto to make people angry by showing them how things could be. But we don't want them just to be angry. We want them to be active. We want them to do a lot of things. And that's where the pressure bit comes in as well. Obviously, we want to put pressure on politicians. There's no better time in the political cycle than to put pressure on politicians when they fear for their seats. Now, of course, there are places where, you know, as we know, they weigh the votes and there's no chance of changing anything. But nonetheless, pressure should be applied to them to know how badly people feel about some kinds of policy. So we have been very effectively lobbying both in Westminster and in constituencies, in person and, dare I say it, digitally. And it's, of course, true that the government's response, you know, has been, you know, pretty much woefully inadequate to lots of things that we've done. But that doesn't mean that we should stop. We should make sure that we keep saying to them. And I said to a group of teachers earlier, you'd be surprised by how little MPs know about education. Well, they weren't surprised at all. They just laughed at me. Well, of course MPs know nothing about education. But it's true. Apart from those who've actually been in education as teachers, you know, they'll tell you that the reason, you know, of course they know about education because their children went to school, you know. Well, it's about as much as I know about hairdressing because I have my hair cut from time to time, you know. I would never get near anyone's head with a pair of scissors. But anyway, the point is that we really do have to make sure that we're putting pressure on them. And so with 2 months to go, it is a good time to be putting pressure on all prospective parliamentary candidates. And we have, of course, the third aspect of that has been our strike action. And, you know, we will focus on having strike action in schools where we think that we can win issues, as well as having national strike action when the time is appropriate. But engaging in that action does require that we take parents and governors with us insofar as we possibly can. I've described this social movement trade unionism and the campaign that colleagues are running here to a lot of unions across Europe in the context of ETUCE. And many have been incredibly impressed by the range of creative approaches we're taking. Not all teachers' unions have yet seen the value of moving beyond their own memberships and their own concerns. But the campaign against germ is taking shape in the European region, and much of it is focusing on the intrusion of IT in the way that I talked about earlier. At a global level, EI will launch at World Congress in Ottawa in July a major campaign to target privatisation and general neoliberal policies. In the global north in particular, and in the global south, it will target the so-called low-cost for-profit schooling. Now, it's low cost to us, but it's not low cost if you're one of those families in the global south. It's important to note here that resisting privatisation is and the move away from the common good that it necessarily entails, we have got a big ally in the UN. Kishore Singh, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, said in October last year, governments must take every effort to strengthen their public education systems rather than allowing or supporting private for-profit education and in order to safeguard the noble cause of education. Not doing so and allowing for-profit schools has failed parents because many of these schools do not deliver quality. This perversely traps poor students into a further life of poverty despite the best efforts of their parents. We're calling on states, he says, to put an end to market-driven education reforms which provide subsidies to private education. Privatisation, by definition, is detrimental to education as a public good and impairs the humanistic mission of education. We must recognise the importance of preserving the social interest in education and uphold education as a public good. So, This is the challenge to teachers' unions, and we must respond to it on a domestic and global level. It is for us to challenge the orthodoxy that competition and privatisation drive up standards, because we have a different view in philosophy of the role and purpose of education. My predecessor as General Secretary of the NUT, Steve Sinnott, was a great internationalist. He worked hard for education for all. Education, he said, was the great liberator. But for education to liberate, it must foster critical thinking and creativity in those whom we teach. I leave you to draw your own conclusions as to whether having the most tested children of any country in the world and a demoralised teaching profession can possibly mean that we can achieve this here in England. In the NUT, we believe that we have to campaign against the forces who would remove the public service ethos and see education systems here and in other places as primarily a source of profit to be milked. So, in the time-honoured tradition, I close with these words: educate, agitate, organise. We have much to win if we do, and a very great deal to lose if we don't. Thank you.